nobody's waiting to come in. So our little normal disclaimer, we are not attorneys, although there's some on, not tonight. Everything discussed is just personal opinions and may not stand up in court. Our hope is that we can open these discussions up to a broader audience and have ideas recorded for the next generation. There's some good high profile boundary surveyors and some college students on from across the country. And our hope is that we can all gain a bit of knowledge from these discussions. And so chapter 15, I'll share my screen here in a second, but chapter 15, when we kind of talked about it, we've kind of hit on these pretty much in the first 14 chapters, always something that comes up when it comes on to understanding words and boundary descriptions. So we've had numerous conversations about this over the last quite a few chapters. So, but there's still obviously a lot more to still even kind of dissect in this this particular chapter. But you do have to, what time are you jumping off? About 5:10ish or something, or 6:10 your time? Or,
6:10ish, 6:05.
Yeah. He's got to go to a planning commission meeting again tonight. So let me share the screen, and should be good. Let's see. Yep. Okay. Got the book. So using and understanding words in boundary descriptions, chapter 15.
Yep.
Where you want to start?
Well, let's just start at the beginning here. We'll read the first sentence and I'll just kind of do some thought dumps here. But he says, perhaps in the cycle of creating or retracing, surveyors should start with this chapter. So apparently this is where we should have started everything.
Should be chapter 1.
Now that we're done with it. And as Trent said, last time we met, I kind of asked at the end of it, should we even do this chapter? Because we've hit so much that's in here. But honestly, as I reread this one and went over our using words as evidence, this is totally different than what we've talked about in the past. There's quite a bit in here to kind of pull out. And so just to kind of give us a refresher and a frame of mind for this chapter, about, let's see, 7 paragraphs down, it says, real property law, as well as the statute of frauds, requires that conveyances, deeds of an interest in real property abide in the following. They need to be in writing, identify grantors and grantees, identify the interest being conveyed, express an intent to convey the interest identified, identify the location of the land or the interests that are being conveyed with legal certainty, be signed by the grantor, and then be accepted by the grantee. So there are kind of two specific property deed descriptions that they examine in this chapter: writing descriptions and then understanding those descriptions. So with that in mind, I think we'll do like we've done in the past. Let's go ahead and read through these principles, and we'll just kind of quiz the room to see if there's ones we want to definitely hit on. And if it's like normal, we'll just start going through because everyone's going to be silent. So, principle 1, a deed may be void ab initio if the description contained in that deed is incapable of being located by a competent surveyor. Principle 2, the description contained on a deed is but one element of the deed, and as such it should be read in unison with all of the other elements. Principle 3, a description is legally sufficient when it relates to how to identify a unique and particular area of property relative to monuments on the surface, below or above the earth, or a water body. Principle 4, a land description to be legally sufficient in the matter of locatability must identify a particular area or areas to which the interest conveyed attaches. Principle 5, if a written conveyance is valid, recorded, and locatable when executed, no later action or event will operate to make the conveyance invalid. Principle 6, junior descriptions should call for the senior description as an adjoiner, or should be written with cause identical to that of the senior adjoiner. Principle 7, before attempting to describe land, the scrivener first must carefully determine the intent of the parties and then select words, keeping in mind the presumed order of importance of description elements, which will precisely describe that intent. Principle 8, legally sufficient description is one that a competent surveyor can locate on the ground. Principle 9, If the intent is to describe land as following a particular survey, that fact must be stated, and the survey must be identified and should be specifically called for. Principle 10, other than senior rights and contrary expressed intentions, a call for a monument is presumed to prevail, and if the intent is to limit the boundaries to a particular existing monument, it must so be stated. Principle 11, directions by bearings are relative to whatever writing define as the basis of bearings. Astronomic north is merely one of the many ways to define directions and is sometimes assumed to be the basis of bearings in the absence of other evidence. When a monument is called for in a written description, that monument, if it is undisturbed, is controlling over other elements in the description. Principle 13, unless specifically specified, a description of a parcel of land includes all of the land within the boundaries. Principle 14, when a new description is created as a result of a retracement, the corners and lines should make reference to the elements recited in the original description. And principle 15, no person should use the same description from one deed to another. A new description should be prepared for each subsequent conveyance. And that principle 15 is definitely, if I'm not here for that one, that's one we definitely need to hit on and discuss today. But let's quiz the room here. Any of those stand out, have questions for, want to make sure we spend some extra time on?
You called it.
Okay, as suspected, we'll just start going through here.
Yeah, I'm with you on 15 though. So
yes. Well, and we even talked about that a little last week too. I mean, let's just start there for a second.
Yeah.
Because that's one that pops out to us. We can go back through there. But the question was asked last time we met. I kept using the term resolving the boundary, right? And I had shared some examples where I've seen people that are quite literally rewriting a boundary that, here's what the deed says, but here's how that deed fits on the ground. And there's a couple different ways I've seen it done where they just completely write an as surveyed description on the face of their survey, or they do, okay, here's and I think it was what principle 14 kind of talks to that when a new description is created as a result of a retracement, the corners and lines make reference to the elements recited in the original description, right? You might say, thence along the southern right-of-way of 100 South Street, 225 feet, and then in parentheses, 225.5 record, right? And so you're making a call back to that record. But John kind of jumped in there and talked about how we really shouldn't be rewriting these deeds. The deed is always correct unless there's some reason that it's just absolutely wrong, right? The ambiguities and the things that the court might have to adjudicate in those cases. So principle 15 here, I mean, someone stop me, but I completely and absolutely disagree with it. I mean, if the deeds...
I would tend to agree with you on that point. For the longest time in Wisconsin, when you resurveyed a property, and this is just recent change we made, you had to provide a meets and bounds description of the exterior of the property that you surveyed, whether it was a lot in a subdivision or a PLS adequate part. You provided a meets and bounds description for it. It was up to the client or the client's attorney what to do with that description. If they use that description in lieu of a lot and block description, does that change the intent or the junior and senior status with respect to their surrounding properties? Because it's no longer a lot and block description, it's a meets and bounds description. And it's in violation of Wisconsin law that says once you're in a subdivision, you have to do the description as per the subdivision plan. We've since changed that so that the surveyor has a choice of how to write that description, whether it's reference to a plat or to a meets and bounds description. But my fear with rewriting descriptions is in our attempt to modernize a description, could we be changing the intent that under which those boundaries were originally created? And are we actually recreating new boundaries by doing that? It's a very dangerous path to go down if you don't understand what you're doing.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And here in California, we don't do new descriptions unless there is a need for it for some reason. For example, I don't know, a title had to be cleared, and we're rewriting a description so to in order to correct a blunder. But even that's on a rare occasion, and like Jerry said, you have to make sure that you're not changing the intent. And one of the main things, for example, that we do is if there's a property that's defined by a lot in a tract, and all of our tracts, of course, here are recorded, then that becomes the original legal description, and there's absolutely no need to change it subsequently.
Yeah, we talked last time a little bit about maybe a combination description, right? You've got 4 or 5 parcels that you're going to, you do a survey on, and then you're combining that into a plat, right? And so you would need to write an overall not corrective, but an overall boundary that combines all those into one. But that really in itself is not a rewriting the description. That's an original description, in the end.
It depends the authority that you're doing that under, and I brought this up before, and we talked about this earlier. In Wisconsin, we have this thing called the assessor's plat, which in essence allows you to resurvey everything and redescribe it according to a plat, whether it's a meets and bounds description or whatever. But basically, it's a court action that basically vacates the old boundaries and recreates the new ones. So there's a process to eliminate the old boundaries and create new ones in their place. You want that to happen in a legal fashion as opposed to just changing the words in the description. If you go back to the very first principle here, it says a description is considered sufficient if a surveyor can locate it. So if you can locate the description, why rewrite it? All right? It's locatable if it's a competent survey. Now, if there are errors in it, then there's a legal process you go through to file a correction instrument and that type of thing to put it in as part of the chain of title. But if it's written in, and this is where we get into the issues, is if it's written in chains and links, and we want to put it in terms of feet because that's what we measure in today, what's a compatible level of accuracy that we have to express it to today to be compatible with what they had in the math? Now it says, that the measurements as stated by the original description are considered exact. But if the bearings are only given to the nearest 10 minutes, how do you write that today? Do you write it to the nearest second? Or like some of these surveyors on their maps and stuff, they show everything to the nearest tenth of a second. For goodness sakes, you can't measure that kind of accuracy just because your software can generate it. So there's these issues here. We can go overboard on it, just like we do with monument nests and that type of thing, and introduce more problems than exist. If you can locate it on the ground, then theoretically it's a sufficient description.
Yeah, and well, we've kind of talked about that principle of your level of accuracy that you're stating on there in previous chapters, right? There's a couple chapters that address that. Your survey only needs to be as accurate as that description was when it was written, right? Meaning if they surveyed in chains, right, you're not measuring to feet on your survey. You're not held to that same to the current standard of measuring to the 100th of a foot, because that original deed was in chains, or maybe some less accurate method of measurement. I mean, the book talked about that a few times.
Yeah, that goes back to a comment that you made earlier, where you said that near the description you give a length, and in the parentheses you say is something else record, different. Yeah. At what point is there a difference enough to indicate that today's measurement and the record measurement don't match, and you have to make that connection between the two? And if you do, does the record override the current? Because the record is the original, right?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. At what point was it? Some of our more senior surveyors, do you have a thought or opinion on that?
I can't think of very many occasions where the new measurement would override record unless I can't. There's
It's just,
yeah.
the
So
only, I mean, if you've got two found original monuments and your distance is different than the record distance doesn't match the monuments, then yeah, your distance is better, but it's still the two monuments that are controlling, not your better distance today. It's just that following the rules of construction, the monuments control over the distance.
Yeah, and what we've started doing is more often historically it hasn't been done quite often enough, but if we're basing a description on a field survey that actually has found monuments, I will include those in the description so that so then the intent can be fully followed.
I can think of one example where I do see, and I would caveat this with the original description always holds, but we have a lot of pioneer lot and block in some of the older cities in Utah, but the monuments for those lot and blocks have not been maintained. You know, the Mormon pioneers settled the valley in the 1840s, 1850s, and then we became a state in the 1890s, and that's when the PLS system came in. And they kind of overwrote these lot and block systems, and there's this weird transition where some cities maintain them, some didn't, and then as cities stop maintaining them, they've been lost. So we have a lot and block, and I'm doing a survey right now. It is a lot. None of the centerline monuments are in, but by survey principles, I'm hitting the roads, and I'm kind of creating the lot based off of the dimensions of the roads and the center lines, right? But there's another survey on the lot adjacent to mine, and they've essentially prorated that lot based off of occupation and the true width of the block itself, and it was within 2 feet, but he held, you know, in his description, everything else held, and I would say the description is lot 4 of whatever block. But I think in order to aid someone in measuring to the corner itself, the corner monument, he's provided a distance to the actual monument that is the corner. But that's only on the face of his survey. There's no deed, there's nothing else that's being changed. It's just a survey that helps the next guy measure to it.
Yeah, bearings and distances being there for informational purposes. I was gonna digress just very slightly, but it's still on topic. We get frequent requests to rewrite a legal description after we do an ALTA survey, and you know, an attorney will write and tell you, oh, we need the meets and bounds description for this property, and I send them back a description. This is a lot 4 of the parcel map, blah blah blah, and he goes, no, I wanted a meets and bounds description. I go, well, this is a bounds description. Your property is bounded by the property lines of parcel 4. I'm not gonna
look it up. That's what it is.
Yeah, I'm not gonna do bearings and distances around and around just so you can follow with your finger on an ALTA and then do something weird with this unvetted description.
No,
Yeah, I'm with you, Connie. I refuse to do that in ALTAs. We're always requested to provide meets and bounds, and I just won't do it. I've seen it harm people in that, you know, they have like 8 parcels, and then somebody described it as a meets and bounds, and then that became their deed. Yeah. And then 40 years later, they're like, oh, we want to subdivide. I'm like, you don't need to. You already have 8 parcels in there, and we have to go through this whole, you know, certificate of compliance battle with the agencies to prove that, you know, they have 8 legal parcels that somebody just wrote as a meets and bounds at one point because they did an ALTA.
Yeah, and it just creates conflict in title, because all of a sudden you have uncertainty of, you know, which description was the intent of the conveyance, and the ALTA description that somebody decided is needed was not the intent of the original conveyance to create
Yeah.
gaps and overlaps and weirdness.
Well, Connie, I think that transitions perfectly maybe to start back at the beginning of the chapter here, where it talks about the type of descriptions there are. So 15.2, it says graphic and written descriptions. So there are two methods of identifying land or an interest in land. One, by graphic representation, which is kind of what you're talking about, a subdivision map, right?
Mhm.
That map in itself becomes a graphic description of a lot. So if it's all of lot 4 of the Connie subdivision, the graphics that are on that subdivision plat become the description,
Mhm.
right? And so there is no other description, no meets and bounds to be written because it's always lot 4 or lot whatever.
And sometimes the way the bearings and distances are notated on the map, at least in the area of where I practice, will tell you whether the lots were meant to be prorated or if the last lot on a block was intended to pick up the remainder.
Yep. And then finally, then it goes through a bunch of written word descriptions. So subdivision descriptions, meets and bounds descriptions, bounds descriptions, proportionate conveyances, area described on being on one side of a described line, strip conveyances, area conveyances, linear conveyances, and then it gets into some indispensable parts of description here and into our principles. But these are all different ways of writing a deed, right? The west half of the east half of the section, right? Or something like that. All these are ways that they're written descriptions. And the principles we've covered up till now help us interpret the intent of what that is. Is there any questions, any discussions about any of those type of things? I think we
Well,
could spend an hour
the
saying
thing
some of
that-
these are bad.
The thing you gotta be careful of with proportionate descriptions, when you're doing things like halves and quarters and that, is it intended to be a controlling term as a quasi meets and bounds description, or is it intended to be a aliquot part? Because if you do the northeast quarter of section 4, that's as per how you would normally aliquotly divide a section. But if you do the northeast 160 acres of section 4, although that's looked at as a nominal acreage of a quarter section, that's not necessarily interpreted in that fashion. And the way you would run those lines in would be totally different. Now, the question is, if they call for 160, was the intent to be an aliquot part? Well, then again, are you reading into the minds of the original conveyors and that type of thing? So even though you get into quarters and halves and that type of thing, you can still run into an issue as to, is that supposed to be a sequentially created part of a larger, or is it intended to be a simultaneously created part of a larger parcel? Because then junior and senior rights are affected, as are how you would apportion gaps and overlaps.
Absolutely. Thanks,
That-
Sherry.
Yeah, I know the Waddles talks about this. Jesse Fant out of Minnesota about 30 years ago put together some publications for the Minnesota Professional Society of Land Surveyors. The one was called Report 4, which was a book on writing legal descriptions in Minnesota. But he went into all sorts of these different types of proportional, directional distance calls, strip descriptions and that type of thing. And some of the really esoteric type of problems you can introduce unintentionally in that process, where what the intent is and what the actual wording is don't necessarily jive. And you introduce these little problems. Particularly strip descriptions are wonderful for that, where you hit a boundary at a non-perpendicular intersection, and you're doing the strip description that's on both sides of a line. Well, when you hit that non-perpendicular boundary, you actually create a gap and overlap in that situation unless you do some language that says extending to and falling short of to ensure that. All sorts of little things like that.
Yeah, when I did right of way work, we did it for utilities.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to resolve boundaries. They would pay a landowner twice if there was a gap or overlap. They just wanted to go through and get it done. But it was standard practice that at the end of every description, the sidelines of the above described easement shall be extended and shortened as to intersect the property lines at the beginning and the end of the description.
And that can happen along water boundaries too, where meander lines are concerned in that type of thing, where the intent is to go to the boundary of water, not to stop at the meander corner short of it. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful discussion. So 15.11, indispensable parts of a description. So we talked a little bit already today about, how a deed may be void, right? If it can't be located, if it's just completely broken, that deed may be void. And then principle 3, a description is legally sufficient on the other end when it relates to how to identify a unique and particular area of property relative to monuments on surface, below or above earth or a body of water. So if we can retrace it, then it's legally sufficient to then be a proper deed. And we talked last time, and I really appreciated the discussion that kind of came up there, because as surveyors, we are starting to understand, or we understand these principles. We can go take a deed and retrace it. The challenge is, like rewriting a description for a title company or attorney. They don't understand. They see this and see it as broken because they don't understand these principles. So how do we? I want to kind of continue that discussion on a little bit as we talk about things. But in writing a deed or interpreting deeds, how do we help them understand that it works? Even though it doesn't close perfectly or it doesn't do all these things, how do we help them understand that this is still a proper deed and that it works?
Well, a couple of things that we've done here in Wisconsin as a surveying community is the attorneys are required to have continuing education, just like a lot of other professionals are. And we volunteer to do presentations to those guys on that. And I've done a couple of presentations with attorneys, dealing with boundary type of stuff, and we address them and point out some of these things to them. So volunteering to contribute to their continuing education, I think, is a good way to do it.
Yeah, one of the things that I see, people struggle with, and even inside the survey community. Granted, if I'm writing a deed, I want that to close, right? If I'm writing a new deed for something, a combination deed, I'm doing my best to, if we will resolve the boundaries like we talked about last time, look at any of those issues and the boundary issues, and if a boundary line agreement or something has to happen. But this is one that really kind of made me chuckle. It's 15.18, the mathematical and legal correctness of closure. So I think out of habit, we all put at the end of our description, thence bearing a distance to the point of beginning, and by doing that, this chapter says, well, then it closes. If you call to the point of beginning, it closes. But, again, we've got some recorders offices that are punching in these deeds. In fact, they're punching some old deeds, and I'll get a call from them saying, hey, this deed does, it's not a proper deed. It doesn't close. And, I'll pull it up and I'll look at it, and, it's not even deeds I've written. And it says, well, yeah, it does. It says to the point of beginning, like it closes, right? But I really did appreciate that was in this chapter. They actually addressed that directly. 1520 is another one I kind of want to talk about a little bit and just take a second. Desirable qualities of a scrivener. Now, it's not, we understand what scrivener is. We don't use that term very much, but there's a list here, and I really kind of appreciate that. A competent scrivener of property descriptions as a minimum should have or develop the following 7 attributes: a knowledge of trigonometry, geometry, and elementary mathematics, knowledge of the legal meaning of all words and phrases used in land descriptions, an appreciation for the authority of the location of known controlling monuments in the area of the description, knowledge of the science of measurements and calculations to prove the correctness of measurements, an understanding of senior rights and adjoining owners, the ability to understand and apply the order of importance of conflicting elements, and the ability to write English effectively and correctly. And it's really that last one. I became a surveyor because I hated English class. Like, I could never comprehend why I'd have to write a 10-page essay when I can convey my thoughts in 3/4 of a page and people understand it, but I've got to be all this flowery language. And now, I'm a point in my career, so I'm a project manager with my company. So it seems that I'm always writing emails and reports and proposals and all of a sudden I'm doing all this English stuff I never wanted to get into in the first place. But the desirable qualities of a scrivener, the ability to write English effectively and correctly. And my spoken word isn't any better. But I'm just curious, how many of us out there are using a program like Legal Aid or any of those programs to write descriptions?
Well, I can show you some doozy of descriptions that have been written using that stuff. Well, they're impossible to retrace.
Yeah, there's those too.
We don't use
You
any.
know.
Yeah, we're all just, no legal aid type stuff. Just
No English
traditional.
type
Yeah.
stuff.
Yep.
I use it, but only for bearings and distances, so that just limits the Scrivener errors when I flip flop numbers. But all the controlling calls and everything else I put in myself. And we got lucky; we had an internal person program a legal writer for us, so that it uses all the qualifying clauses and language exactly the way we want to see it. So that's been a little bit cushy. But as far as writing English effectively and correctly, there's sometimes a comma can change your meaning. It's important.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's analogous to, and I try to use this when we talk about software in general. Um, that is a tool, and the way Connie's talking about using it as a tool to augment what they're normally doing, it's like learning a word processor. You don't expect a word processor to write your prose for you. You expect it to be a tool to help you more effectively communicate what you understand about putting information together, about writing sentences. You still have to know grammar and words, that type of thing, sentence structure. The software is merely there as a tool to help you do it more efficiently. But you still got to make the decisions. Otherwise, you will start to lose the importance of the calls and stuff that you need. And what does control the line? It's not just a bearing and a distance generated by the software, but there's a call for an adjoiner or a call for an adjacent survey and that type of thing. All that kind of stuff is the surveyor's expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm like Connie. I personally do use legal aid to get the meets and bounds in there correctly. But I thought we'd just take a second to talk through what that looks like, at least for me. I used to let some of my, survey and training guys use it. I said, hey, will you write this description, take a crack at it, punch it through legal aid so you get at least the numbers correctly and the, the directions correctly. That's the one I always see a big error in is they'll flip the northeast to a southwest often because they've drawn it in CAD and they just read the number off of CAD and it will label it backwards, right? So I'm like, throw it in legal aid, get the description out, and then fill it out, complete it, right? And they hand me a description that is every of the little legal aid quirk is still in there, right? They don't go through and clean up. And so we'll redline, we'll talk about, okay, this is like Jerry said, this is a tool. This is where we start. So we get the numbers corrected. We've got to fill it out here. But I've actually stopped if I'm having a trainee write me a description, I'm a jerk and I've stopped letting them use legal aid because it's more work and they're not learning anything. They're not learning this stuff here, right? And I see more mistakes because they just rely on something else to do it. So, I'm having them go through the long form and write it and go through there.
Yeah, they have to go through that process first to learn what the concepts are behind it. before they try to use the software as a tool to take care of it for them and do it for them and that type of thing. So
Yep.
it's don't let the technology drive what you're doing. You know, have the technology augment what you're doing. It's supposed to be there to make your life easier, not to dictate how you're going to do things.
Yep. And I'll just
Yeah.
throw out some tips and tricks here real fast in writing a description. Is it's one thing to go through and write it, whether you're using a writing aid or doing it long form. But I always encourage everyone to have someone else review it, just like anything, have a QA QC process. But then after it's QA QC, the other thing I have, and we talked about this closure just a second ago, but I always have them go back through and repunch it. You wrote it, but go back and punch in what you wrote. Does when you drafted it, open a clean AutoCAD drawing, don't look at what you did before, write it as a fresh deed, even if you've got to do it the next day, but repunch it, because often you'll find mistakes in just repunching it and looking at it again fresh.
Do you guys always do exhibits with your legal descriptions, or do you just do legal descriptions alone?
It depends. It depends. I mean, if I'm writing a description, it's usually to go along with the plat. Again, not
Okay.
rewriting a deed that's there. If I'm doing a description of an easement or, a portion of a property that gets platted and I've got to write the description that they're buying of the overall, I will usually do some sort of exhibit with that, a graphic display of what I'm intending to write. And usually that's just so the client understands what I'm providing. But the
Yeah.
hope is that it does get into, the actual final documents.
Yeah, no, we always do an exhibit with a legal description, and we actually include a reference to that exhibit in the description itself. However, you have to be careful with the language. Some people say also as shown on Exhibit A attached here to them, but by this reference made a part hereof, which if you follow that language precisely, it kind of tells you at the end to disregard everything that's in the description and follow the plat. So instead of also shown as, instead of shown as, hold on, instead of shown on a plat, I also say also shown on the plat attached here to, so that people are using the plat as a visual aid rather than a prevailing element of the description. But usually I have people draw up the plat first while they're planning how to write the legal description. Then I have them write the description. Then I have them triple space it, review everything. And then we go through, how do we follow the description? Does it have all the qualifying calls? How do you follow it on the plat? And then at the end, I have them do the closures and go through it one more time.
See, when you write your description, do you include the calls for the monuments in it, even if you attach that map to it?
Yes.
Okay, because not everybody does. That's part of the problem is if the presumption is that the map becomes part of the description, but the map becomes separated from it for whatever reason, then that the monument calls, which are part of the map, are not part of the meets and bounds description type of thing. So
Yeah, no,
there's those issues in that.
we include everything that's on the inside the body of the description is also shown on the exhibit, and there shouldn't be anything on the exhibit that's not included in the description other than scale and the north arrow.
Right.
So we cross-check that through the QA/QC process. And also one of the things that I'm stickler at, if I used a certain phrase to describe a certain parcel in a description, I want that phrase transposed onto the plat exactly. I don't want to change language just a little bit so that who knows who can accidentally misinterpret it as something else, 17 years down the road.
Do you distinguish between found and set monuments?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, for legal descriptions, we never set monuments really. Well, in California, if you set a monument, you have to file a record of survey.
Okay,
So it's a whole different process. So we never set monuments that are not documented somewhere in county records.
okay.
And if somebody calls us to monument the property for some reason, then that always has to follow with a record of survey. Then if there's a new description needed, it can be written off the record of survey, but that's pretty unusual. Sometimes we have a processes of what's called a lot line adjustment, where people are just adjusting a line to accommodate a form of a boundary agreement. I don't know if you guys use lot line adjustments in other states. But the process is sometimes the lot line adjustment will need to be monumented. So that needs to be followed up with a record of survey. But when you create a lot line adjustment and it's then processed by the agencies after the lot line adjustment itself has been approved, and a lot line adjustment contains the plat and the legal description, then a set of what's called perfecting deeds are recorded separately, which actually make the title now match what's shown on the lot line adjustment, and then it enters that lot line adjustment into the chain of title. So we're pretty careful about not leaving things dangling out there too much.
Yeah, lot line adjustment. I mean, when I think of that, it's usually we're trying to match where a fence was built or something like that. There's some sort of correction being made. So, I'm making calls into the artificial monuments. This is a lot line adjustment to follow, bearing a distance along a fence as built. This is the type of fence to a property, to a property corner or something like that. So I try and make those calls too in a lot line adjustment or that type of description.
Yeah.
Explain the intent on there, right?
Yes. Yes.
And that kind of gets us into the next couple sections here in parts of a description. So we're talking about writing description. There's three main parts: the caption, the body, and then the qualifying clauses. So the caption is a logical arrangement in writing descriptions is to first recite the general area or locality of the land so that attention is directed to a vicinity. The caption or introductory part of a description serves this purpose. And then there's a checklist: state, county or parish, city, subdivision, map name, meridian, township range, section, land grant, court map, or any other identifier map, recorded conveyance, being a part of, parcel whatever as described in this deed found at this record location, place where recorded map or recorded conveyance is filed. And then we get into the body of the description, and I'll just read this first part. The body of a description identifies a particular land area within the locality designated by the caption. The body taken together with the caption must identify a certain area, otherwise the conveyance will be void. In addition, the body ought to contain complete dimensional information that renders the intent of the deed more certain and clear.
Come on, Jack.
And then finally, qualifying causes. This portion of the description may perhaps be considered as being used to forestall future legal problems if the description elements are ever questioned. If elements or prior phrases in the body leave the attorney, the court, or the surveyor with ambiguities, then this clause can be used to eliminate any possible ambiguities. For instance, if a portion of the description calls thence along the road, this clause can be used to explain that the intent is to have the boundary as following the center line, or it could be used to show the intent of the line from corner 5 to corner 6 is intended to be the thalweg of the creek as of June 9th, 2010. There are no limitations on what is explained in this clause. Such phrases, the lines between the respective corners are computed distances and angles from random traverse runs between proven corners of the original description. So I want to throw out there this qualifying cause is probably one I don't see as much other than, at the end of a meets and bounds call. But thoughts on qualifying causes? What have you seen? What have you seen done well? What have you seen done poorly? I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of descriptions that have a lot of like a sub paragraph qualifying call. And when I do, it's probably a basis of bearings call. The basis of bearings for this description is this, so that you can actually have some sort of rotation in there. And that's about the only time I see that type of call.
I can't say that I've seen very many of these. I mean, usually, with easements and the angle points, and
Yeah, you could also have an augmenting clause in there. I generally look at them as two separate things aligned. Qualifying clause is something that limits or puts a restriction or an encumbrance on a property, whereas an augmenting clause adds something to it. So together with an easement for ingress and egress purposes, and that type of thing is an augmenting clause. But that's also a qualifier because it's saying besides what we're conveying here, this is some change to it and that type of thing. So I tend to think of it in terms of, is there anything that restricts or augments what the conveyance consists of? In that case, you would put it in kind of like before the summation at the end of the description.
Together with an easement for access, or less than accepting this portion sold off at this time,
or like you were saying before with the strip description, where at the very end you put saying, and extending the lines, to intersect, that augments the actual description itself because you're clarifying that particular situation. Or said sidelines are said lines are to extend through the meander corners to intersect the waterway, so it's understood that there's no strip that's left between the waterway and that type of thing. That just kind of augments or clarifies what's being given in the body of the description.
I've used the qualifying clauses, or really the exception clauses. Sometimes when you have these long easements that run across 5 and 6 and 7 properties, and you have to grant the deal with each property separately, I will, in a preamble, let's say there are lots 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 of some subdivision, I will limit the description in a preamble to say lot 9. I will leave the entire length of the description in the body of the description, and then I will add a qualifying clause probably at the end, accepting therefrom that portion of said strip lying within lots 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7, so that it reinforces at the beginning that my intent to include just one lot wasn't a blunder, but that's literally the intent of the description. But I'm running more and more surveyors who are afraid to do that, basically saying, oh no, we have to write a little chunk of strip for each each owner separately. And that always bothers me because I'm going, these are going to get separated, basis of variance could be tweaked. You're going to end with an easement that's possibly zigzagging across properties when it was meant to go in a straight line. So that always creates some heated discussions about which way to write it.
I like that. I agree. I've seen a lot of that where it gets broken up, but anytime you do that, you're just opening yourself up to make some sort of error in there when you've got to write a bunch of different ones and then somehow make sure they all fit together.
Yeah,
I like that. 1526 calls for a survey. Again, every state's going to be a little different. We've talked about the uniqueness of Utah, where the survey is a separate document that doesn't go in the land record, but filed at the surveyor's office. But anytime that I have a description that I'm writing that has a survey adjacent that has merit to what I'm trying to accomplish, I will say thence along that line as described in survey, see file number, dated this, and so there's some good things. These are just more to add clarity. As our land records have grown from, there was no surveys 150 years ago to now, we have more surveys, more information. Let's, adding this in just makes a more robust description and more complete picture of intent as we go through here. We've talked about calls for monuments. Lines. Invisible lines constitute the perimeter of all described lands. These invisible lines may be straight, circular curve, spiral curve to fit the intersection of the Earth's surface with a given elevation, gradient of geometric relationship, geodetic, irregular, except for those continuous lines described as follows. For the perimeter of a geometric area, a line description forming one side of an area must describe a definite starting point and describe a definite terminus. So it's just something to think about is as we describe these, or, that's, we've all wrote those descriptions. Thence along a line, and there is no end to it, right? Or I was just reading a description where thence along northeasterly, along the edge of a railroad right away to a point west of the point of beginning, and then east to the point of beginning. While there is some sort of definite end to that, really what I have to do is I have to draw it to a point, and then I have to come back to the beginning and come backwards to describe it, right? And see where those intersect. But that really is no definite terminus to that point. There is a lot of open-endedness, because what is east, right? Is it due east? Was it east parallel to the south line? East along the fence. East is you just kind of, again, Utah, the mountains are on the east. East is you were looking at the mountains and you kind of just walked east. So there is some ambiguity in there. So definite terminus and beginning to our lines and our calls, our curves, any of those type of meets descriptions. More clarity we can add to those. 1529. Here's a little Trent soapbox. Basis of bearings. So all my maps say basis of bearings plural, because that basis controls all the bearings on my map, just not one. I know it's silly, but whenever I see a basis of bearing singular, I always ask, well, what bearing is this controlling? So I like that this was plural, plural in this chapter here. But I see some descriptions, and depending on how we measure and where we're measuring, it's good to have a basis of bearing in the description. Let's describe how we're setting up this map. In Utah, often we'll call north, beginning at a point which is north, distance along north, a distance or north bearing in distance, and then, a perpendicular distance to the point of beginning. And it's generally assumed that north or north bearing is along the section line, but not always the case. So if you have some sort of basis of bearings called out there, if that first call, is it really along a section line, or is it just an as measured bearing?
Well, to take that a step further, even if you call out the section line, actually it should be a quarter line, it shouldn't be a section line, because the section line gets bent at the quarter corner. I mean, you get really nitpicky on this, but what was the section line at the time that the bearings were established? Because it could be something different today, depending on what the remonumentation was in that. I mean, did somebody use something that was an incorrect reference to it? So I'm always telling people, if you do that, identify what physically demarks that thing on the ground, so that we know what you meant by the section line. Same thing with the point of commencement. When you say commencing at the west quarter corner of section 24, well, what was at the west quarter corner? Where did you start at the west quarter corner? I mean, you have to tie it down a little bit more than just a reference to the section lines or the section corners. We got to know what section lines or what the section corners were at the time that the basis was established. I'm tripping over my tongue.
Yeah, I consider myself rebuked, because that's one thing I always just say.
It's not a rebuke. It's not a rebuking. It's you always got, when you're writing legal descriptions, you got to write them from the perspective of, how am I going to interpret this? If I have to interpret this in 50 years, am I going to understand what the hell it is I'm talking about? Because,
Yep.
you know, somebody else is going to be interpreting later on what you're writing today. And if you want them to understand what the intent was, you got to be explicit on that. Just like when you look at a description, you want that description that you're retracing to be as explicit as possible. You know, so
Yeah.
it's as well as you got to know how to interpret a description or write a description, and vice versa. So it's a big circle type of thing.
Yeah. No, I just like, I you know, those one of those principles I know, right? But I don't always follow. But you know, as we discuss this, I'm like, okay, Trent, this is one thing to add to your repertoire. Beginning at the southwest corner of sections township range, being a brass cap dated 1967. And you could really carry at the intersection, whatever, whatever, however you need to describe that. But even describing the type of monument you're finding, if someone then 50 years from now goes back there and they don't find a brass cap dated 1967, but they find an aluminum cap dated 2037, right? Then that throws up a flag. Okay, is this the actual same location? Do I need to do more verification? It helps to inform what's going on. So it's just, yeah, I'm not rebuked, but I definitely am like, okay, Trent, let's add this to the repertoire. Let's learn and grow. And
but even better, that thing that you accepted and used as a section corner, somebody else comes along and reestablishes that corner in a better location because of evidence. That doesn't automatically move your survey over a foot and a half or 2 feet and that type of thing. You're still tied to what the original physical thing was that the description was written with respect to, not what the current representation of that section corner is. So by identifying the physical thing that you started at, that ties it down. It doesn't move around.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in a perfect world, if the monument pedigree has actually been followed and recorded, then you will know if the new monument represents the old monument or not.
Right, right. And do you you don't pull the old monument out, throw it away because it's no good. Say, I got a better location, so I'm gonna take that other one and throw it away so that nobody else gets tripped up on it. Nah, hell, because then you're disturbing what potentially might have authority with respect to a different property. What you do is you reference it. You know, when you put it on your tie sheet, says this is what I accepted, this is what was there, and this is how it references with respect to it. That's that hierarchy and stuff that Connie's talking about. There's is
Yeah, one of the things that we do, just to reinforce a little bit what Jerry's talking about, is when I start my descriptions, I don't necessarily always start at the corner that's my point of beginning of the actual land described, but I start at a good reference line that is well documented. So I might start, if I know the area and I know the center line is well monumented, and we went off of that particular center line and of the monuments that are already shown on a certain record map, I will put that in my description at the beginning, saying commencing at, I don't know, southerly terminus of or a certain street intersection, going along that street center line to another location as shown on blah blah blah, and then properly reference the map where that initial basis of bearings and a location can be established, so that anybody's when they're calculating my description, they can go and basically hanging on the underlying map and then use that in their boundary establishment to locate the description based on the map that it's based off of. And usually my first course in the description is intended as the basis of bearings for the rest of the description.
We'll get into a lot of this when we get into Waddles and start talking about legal descriptions after this one. We'll solve all this: the point of commencement, the true point of beginning, the point of beginning, all those different nuances. We're going to solve it, and we're going to rewrite the book coming up in the next book, and we'll get everyone in the country on the same page. But I had some great discussion.
Those are some lofty goals.
Yes. But to kind of move the discussion along, there are a couple of things that I did want to point out here in this chapter. This Trent had it up here. I'm flipping between so I can see people talk and what we've got. But we're looking at these lines defined by geometric relationships. So parallel to, perpendicular to, concentric with. I mean, there is a ton of discussion that can happen with how we are describing relationships. Parallel to and equidistant from the center line of the road or the east line of a section. And there's I know in our state conferences we've got tons of discussion going on. What is the right way? How do you interpret that? How do you write that? But definitely some ways to think about, and we could have some discussion here, but when we write those type of geometric relationships, how should that be written? So Jerry says perpendicular to and perpendicular, and
Parallel
it
with.
just popped up there. Then I lost it. Parallel with. Agreed. But then here, looking at the creek, 100 foot from and parallel with the creek, but that, you can see how that actually has some issues because the creek's got some bends in it. But parallel would be the distance doesn't work there. Area curves. So we could get into a long discussion too about how do we write curves. Concave east, concave west, curve to the right, curve to the left, and what goes in there. And I think Jerry and John have both had some long discussions about why the concave is not the appropriate way to write. I can see him shuddering, and I agree. No, it doesn't make sense. So, forms used to indicate superior calls, strip conveyance. I'm just seeing if there's anything here that I definitely had. I think I hit most of the items I had to go through. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to jump off. I think we've hit it all, but anything else you guys wanted to hit? There is 15.44 checklist for descriptions. That's probably one to print out and just have as you're looking at writing them, training young surveyors on how to write them would be a great one. And that gets us to the end where we talked about principle 15 and how that needs to be taken out of the book. So that's what I got.
Anybody else want to continue the conversation? What else we want to add or talk about? Things we missed?
I actually have to jump off too. Every second Wednesday is the CLSA or our surveyor association meeting. So I got to jump off this one and jump onto that one.
There
Thanks
you
for
go.
the great discussion, everybody.
Awesome.
Thanks
Matt.
guys. Have a good night.
I think if we continue discussing legals, we're going to stay here for next 3 years. So we're going to save that for the Waddles book review.
There you go.
Yeah, the only, I guess a closing comment I would have with respect to this is it's like any writing. The only way to get good at it is to do it and not depend on software, but to sit down and write descriptions and then look to see if it, doesn't match the rules of construction. If somebody has to depend on your description later on to reestablish a boundary, do you have encapsulated in that description what the intent was, and they can, reestablish it without saying, well, what did he mean by this? Are there any ambiguities in it?
Yeah, good points. Which kind of goes back with what Trent said in the very beginning about replotting it almost again, right? Replotting it multiple times.
What I found, what's the biggest mistake the students make when I work with them writing descriptions, they'll drop a course. Pick out a longer description. And what I tell them to do is, instead of trying to write this one dense paragraph, which is what it ultimately winds up being, is to separate and write each course description as a separate paragraph. Make sure it's all there, and then they can collapse it. It's easier to see that way and to visualize it and make sure you get all the pieces there. Because the last thing you want is a missing course description.
Yeah. Man,
that really screws things up.
I actually insist on submitting hours and recording them with every dents. It needs to be in a new line.
Yeah.
They just go from double space to single space once they're recorded, but
Oh yeah, but attorneys and title people hate that because that's extra space, extra pages that have to get recorded. That's more fees that they have to get
Mhm.
charged for. They'd rather have it all collapsed on. That's why they don't like to include surveyors maps and stuff with stuff, because that's just another page that's got to get recorded.
well, that's cheaper than a cloud on title.
Right.
Yeah, explain that to them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I say those things, yes.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Anything else by anybody?
One last thing for me.
Yeah,
I'm
go for
I'm
it.
out in Ohio.
Yeah.
Often the plats are documented, but we don't necessarily record them. So they're documented in a GIS type system. They're not necessarily recorded. So with that said, the legal description is definitely the document that creates the conveyance. It's not the plat of survey, it's the legal description.
Really?
So with that said, you have to make sure that you have all the data inside that legal description that is going to convey what you want to happen. I mean, basically what I've always been taught from forever was the legal description is just a memorialization of the information shown on your plat of survey.
Right.
That's crazy.
Pretty straightforward,
Is
pretty
a
simple.
plat is
Yeah.
a plat or graphic ever attached to that description, or is it strictly
It's like I said, it's just kind of it's recorded in like a GIS system, but it's not attached to it.
Wow.
You go across the state line to Indiana, and it's attached to it.
That's right. Yeah.
But not in Ohio, not in Kentucky. Well, not in the jurisdictions I work in. Let's
Yeah.
put it that way.
Yeah.
So, Connie, I have a question for you about
Sure.
California law. So, when we say that it's Exhibit B, a map here to attach thereof is being a part of it,
Mhm.
and if you create one page and then the second page, those should be recorded at the same time because in your legal description, you made that part of the legal description. Is that
Correct.
the evidence that you see as far as how it retains to California law?
Well, yes. I mean, by putting a reference into the legal description, we're telling them if the exhibit is not attached, this is not a complete document.
Correct. And
So
it's
they
not a
need
correct
to-
legal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we use that the exhibit to basically clarify what's in the description. So it shouldn't prevail, but it's there, just like if you have a qualifying call, then bearing a distance is not going to prevail. It's going to be the qualifying call. And then if, I don't know, bearing a distance is fuzzy in the description or we have a typo, then the exhibit is there to help you interpret the intent of the legal description. And what happens, most people go to the exhibit, they plot things off of the exhibit, and if
They don't
there's an
even look at
error
the legal.
in the legal on the exhibit instead of the legal, it doesn't get noticed.
Well, and
So-
I've done a lot for like lot line adjustments and easements that way, and I think it's a great way to do that. I wasn't, spent 20 years surveying in Minnesota, and that wasn't always the case. So I actually like the fact that it's exhibit here too is made a part thereof. I like the qualifying statement that becomes the legal because that means it has to be filed together.
Yeah, then everybody's on notice that something's deficient
Missing.
about the
Yep, or
document.
missing. Yep,
Yep.
correct.
Good stuff. What else? Anything else? Nothing?
I'm afraid to bring up more about legals. I'll be talking forever.
All right. We'll save it for the conference.
It's like you say, we can keep on going all night on this. Yeah.
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 Jerry's gonna have some good stuff at the conference for us. All about
Oh, yeah. Oh,
legal
nice.
description. So yep. So we will we can save it for then. Awesome.
Very cool.
All right, guys.
Excellent discussion.
Yep, as always. Have a good
Yeah.
night, everybody.
Okay,
Thank
good
you,
night.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.